Transition. Hey, we're live. Whee! So, hello everyone. Good evening, good morning, good middle of the day, good midnight if that's where you are. Happy time zone. Uh, I am Laura VanArendonk Baugh. This is To Write and Have Written, and this is the fifth Tuesday in the month, which means it's a field trip week. So instead of talking about businessy things or, you know, yes, grown-up stuff, we get to go and do something fun. This time, we're still technically on topic. This is still going to be a world building theme, but we're going to pull. You've heard me say multiple times, your best world building information is in history because we've had thousands and thousands and thousands of years for people to try things and see how they worked. So we're going to talk about a period that nobody ever talks about really in U.S. history, but real quickly. Oh, hi, Erie Hollows, which is, by the way, one of the coolest usernames ever. And hey, Sophie is here too. Awesome. Okay. Anyway, I have no idea where I was. Oh, yeah. So we're going to talk. This is Elena. Let's see, where did I leave you? You're over here. Here we go. This is Elena.
One side of the screen or the other. You got a 50% chance.
I got to pick here. Elena VanArendonk. We are related with a name like that. Absolutely. But she also, well, actually, do you want to just say what your history connection is? Like, why are you qualified to speak on this?
I'm a nerd. So I have studied history formally. I minored in history at the university level, and I'm also part of historic preservation organization. I am the secretary and a bunch of other titles of the Franklin Township Historical Society, which is an Indianapolis-based organization, Franklin Township being part of Indianapolis. And I've been on the board for about 18 years, a lot of years. So I have
At
become
this
very
point, it's
familiar with,
historical.
yeah, I'm a relic, I think, is how that works. So I've become very educated through necessity about the last couple hundred years since the settlement of this part of the country that I am located in and that our township is located in started around the 1820s. So pretty much from the 1820s up to present day, because I speak to school groups and people come into our building and I give tours and I give presentations and things, I have had to become knowledgeable about a lot of things from that period in particular.
So I asked Elena to come here today to speak about the interurban, which is a word that some people know, but quite honestly, I'm really surprised at how few people are familiar with the interurban and its place in U.S. history. So I'm just going to introduce this is how equine influenza meant that your sewing machines got to run. That's where we're gonna there's your hook right there. Okay, so so what I thought is I'm just gonna turn Elena loose to run with this, and then I'll
Ah!
jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in with where I have questions or want to expand or just want to nerd on something, and then absolutely please, of course, throw questions in the chat. And my goal for this is very much like all the field trip kind of things, is I want to go and explore something that's a little bit cool, but then please use this for both education and inspiration. And I get so many of my ideas or work things out like how can this possibly function by just filling up my brain with nonfiction. Like that's it's a great way to do it. Just put all the pieces in there and let them jumble together. So yeah, so that's where we're going with this. I think this is pretty cool. This is something that honestly a lot of people, I just had some friends in from out of town, and we were down in Irvington where they still have some interurban tracks visible. And I'm like, "Do you know what this is?" They're like, "No," and I'm like, "Yeah, too bad. You're duct taped to the wall now, and I'm going to tell you." So let's get in and do this. So yeah, Bridger says, "Put all the pieces in there and let them jumble." Is 100% legit world building. Absolutely, this is why. When we talked about ramen, or when we talked about the murders in the Galapagos Islands or whatever, like you can just grab so many pieces. But who would have thought that a high profile hostage situation is why cup ramen got big? Like, okay, like these are the kind of things you can grab and run with. So, yeah. Oh, thank you for the sub, Shy Red Fox. I appreciate that. Okay, Elena, I'm going to stop getting in your way and let you, like, Start with us.
It's
Where are
your
we going? Where are
stream.
we?
You can talk too.
Where are we going to start?
We're going to start with the pandemic, except it wasn't actually a pandemic. It was an episodic because it was in the animal world and it was isolated to, I mean, it started regionally. It actually started in Canada and spread to the US. So in the early 1870s, there was a severe outbreak of a new strain of equine influenza that sickened thousands and thousands of horses. And it started, most people think somewhere near Toronto and then spread because, transportation was horse-based at that time. There was a lot of contact between animals. Cities were densely packed. And really, your transportation options in the 1870s were horses for local or shorter distance travel, or steam engines for longer distance travel, because we did have steam trains. But there were not a lot of local, non equine based options for transit, except for walking, which did not always work in some regions. You didn't always have the terrain for that. So horses were used for deliveries. Horses were used for transportation for people and goods. Horses were used for carrying messages if you didn't have telegraph to certain areas. Everything was based around horses. And when thousands of horses got sick and died in 1871 and 1872, people started realizing, hey, now that we've got this establishment of all these cities with lots and lots of people and lots of places we need to be going, maybe it's time to start thinking about making some means of transporting things that don't revolve around horses, because the transit industry and the goods delivery industries were crippled for months because all the horses were sick. Even the horses who didn't die were unable to work because influenza is very hard. And it can be very damaging. So that spurred people to start investigating other options. Now, steam engines were used for a lot of things, including children's toys. Which that's another road we can go down. Why you shouldn't give your toddler a steam engine for
Actually,
Christmas.
I want to spend like just a moment there. She's not kidding. Like you could get your kid a little locomotive and fire it up with a little boiler that was actually burning and boiling and occasionally blowing up, and like let
It
him
might
drive
burn
it
your
around your
house down,
house.
but at least your kid will be happy.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, there were steam systems that were supposed to power your household appliances, and those went horribly wrong too. So anyway, that's a separate topic. But steam was not always practical for most situations, for a lot of the reasons we're talking about. It was loud, it could be dangerous, it required a lot of fuel, it required, having hot steam coming out of things. So that while there were certainly steam-powered automobiles, in fact, my great-grandfather owned one, they were not a really practical way of transporting goods and people in en masse. So over the next couple of decades, there was a lot of interest in electricity. You had the Edison and Tesla wars going on during this time, and eventually, by the 1890s, electricity had been refined to the degree that it could power things like streetcars. So you began seeing electric cable systems in cities. You had streetcars that were powered, just like some of the trolleys that still run on electricity today in San Francisco and places. They all started around the turn of the century. And you would have a wheel or a hook with a line that ran to the streetcar, and it would run down a cable system that was suspended over the street. And that's how it powered the streetcar. And around 1890, somebody got the bright idea, hey, if we're running electric streetcars in cities, why don't we make long distance electric rail travel? And that is the birth of the interurban. By around 1890, there were still primarily horse-drawn modes of transit in cities. By 1897, horses were the exception to public transit situations. So you had horse-drawn cars and horse-drawn trolleys were almost entirely replaced by the turn of the century in most major cities. So this caught on very quickly. Cities were becoming electrified, major cities, not your small towns yet, we'll get to that, but the major cities were putting in electricity to power not just household things and not just industrial concerns, but also public transit.
But
And
Elena,
then
every time I read a historical novel or watch a historical movie, it is always horses, 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 right up until 1921, when suddenly we have, like, the Auburn and the
then,
Duesenberg.
then you have the really sexy cars. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in some areas, if you were in a small town, you might not have electric streetcars. But yeah, the 1890s are when personal automobiles started becoming available on a, I won't say a widespread scale, but they certainly were available if you wanted to special order one. To give a personal example, I mentioned my great grandfather. He had what is possibly the first personal car in Indianapolis. A crowd gathered at the train station to watch it be offloaded from the train that delivered it, and that was in 1895. And it was a steam powered car. He later replaced it with an internal combustion car about 1898 or 9, I think. I'm not sure on the dates on that. But this is the 1890s and people were driving cars. There weren't a lot of them, but they existed. And by about 1905, there were so many cars in New York that there was actually a lawsuit from automobile owners trying to bar horses from public roadways because the horses were too slow and they were causing traffic jams because there were so many cars in New York City. So yeah, if you're reading a book and it's 1910 and there are only horses in a major city, it's not
Oh,
really
people are
accurate.
shocked to see an automobile in 1917.
Yeah,
Guys,
I
guys. Yeah.
recently watched a production. I'm not going to name it because that would be mean, but it offended me deeply because it's supposed to take place in, I think, 1910, like right around there, a little before World War I starts. And there's a crowd of people on Coney Island and they watch a horseless carriage roll into view and they are shocked and they say, "But how does it move without horses?" And I'm staring at this going, I'm sorry, 1910? There were more cars than horses in the city by
Also,
1910.
we have tanks, right? Like,
Yeah,
like
like
tanks. Yeah.
the,
Yeah.
just do your homework, people.
Okay. Sorry. Just had to
That's fine.
veer off for a moment.
Um, so anyway, by the mid 1890s, electricity was replacing horses for public transit in urban settings. Now, long distance was still primarily steam train. More rural areas didn't necessarily have electricity because electricity was actually not considered a public utility at this time in history. Electricity was a for-profit enterprise. So if a company didn't think they could get enough profit from your town by running, the very expensive infrastructure out to your town, they just wouldn't bother because if there weren't enough people in your town to make it worth them putting in the infrastructure, they weren't going to worry about it. And because it was a for profit concern, and because we did not yet have the same kind of antitrust legislation that we do now, you had a lot of monopoly situations where the power company would provide power to the businesses, the homes, anything that they needed. They would also own the traction lines. They would also own the other concerns that used electricity. They would give themselves a cut rate, and then it was all, there was a lot of shady stuff going on with the power companies, and there were multiple power companies, and they were in competition with each other. So
Wait,
you
wait.
didn't
Are you
necessarily.
suggesting there might be corporate profiteering during the Gilded Age? Is that something I heard?
There might be a reason the
Huh.
term robber barons came into use. Yes. Um,
Sorry.
so yeah,
We
yeah.
did get a comment from Shy Red Fox saying loving these rants, LOL. So I said good because they're probably not going away anytime soon.
No,
So
you're gonna
yeah,
have them for another 45 minutes. It's fine.
yeah.
So
All right,
anyway,
carry on.
1890s, people started looking at long distance options for electric rail travel. And the interurbans should not be confused with electric streetcars. They're very similar and they run on the exact same system, but the interurban cars are massive. If you see photos of them, they are enormous. They are, as big or bigger than a freight car, whereas the streetcars were more like the size of a city bus. So it was capable of holding a lot more people, and they actually traveled at quite fast speeds. The interurbans in the Midwestern area. Now this is going to depend on your terrain partly because they are trains, and if you have tracks with a lot of curves in them or a lot of elevation changes, obviously they're going to have to go slower. But it was pretty common in the Midwest for interurbans to travel between 60 and 80 miles an hour. This is in an era when 30 miles an hour was considered fast for a car in a standard driving situation if it wasn't a race car or something. So they could go much faster than personal vehicles could, which is one of the reasons they were so popular. And so the traction companies, and the traction refers to the type of system it was, where you had rails and a rail car that was running off of a power line, basically. The traction companies were in fierce competition to see who could lay the fastest track and get the most customers. In the Indianapolis area, and again, that's the area I'm most familiar with and the area I've done the most research on, there were actually 7 traction companies in competition operating in and around Indianapolis itself. So you had the streetcars in downtown Indianapolis, but then if you wanted to go out to the towns surrounding Indianapolis, which at that time, now they've all been absorbed by suburban sprawl, because that's what happens with cities in modern times. But there used to be smaller communities sort of circling the city that was maybe, on a horse, it might be half a day's ride out. But if you had an interurban, you could get there in an hour. Um, so they were starting to lay these tracks out in sort of a spoke pattern from all the major cities. And by the early 1900s, by around 1908, 1910, it was said that you could get on an interurban train in New York and travel all the way to Wisconsin without ever taking any other mode of transportation, if you didn't mind making a lot of changes and getting a lot of new tokens along the way, because they were run by different companies. So that's how vast they were. They were spread out so much and connected so many of the major cities and to the smaller towns that it was really a great network. You could pretty much travel anywhere you needed to without hopping on a steam train or without finding somebody with a long distance capable vehicle. And they were super popular. They were not the safest mode of transit, but this is again the era of steam boilers, and nothing was safe, and anything could explode at any moment. So there were occasional crashes, there were fatalities, there were derailments, just like you have with any other mode of cars are also not totally safe either. We have car crashes every day. Airplanes are not entirely safe. There is no entirely safe mode of transit, but they were fairly reliable because there were so many of them. And a lot of the interurbans departed every hour because there were people commuting now. Commuting wasn't really an option before because you didn't have a reliable, fast mode of transit to get from a suburban town to the big city. But if you were in a city that was now only half an hour away from the big city by interurban, there was no reason not to pay a token, hop on the train, go into the city where you could maybe get a better job. So this is really the birth of commuter rail.
So on
And
that point, we have a
yeah,
question. Sherrod Fox asked about the inspiration for the Ticket to Ride board game. So can you speak to that a little bit?
um, the Ticket to Ride is, as far as I know, and I have played the game a few times, but I do not know much about its development. As far as I know, it is mostly just inspired by the idea of the competing rail networks of the steam lines. But it is true that the same pattern happened with the interurbans, where the steam rail, you had all of the different railroad barons trying to claim as much territory as possible, put down their tracks, and so they had the right of way because they were there first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the same thing happened with the interurbans, where you would have different companies who were trying to get to certain areas, and if they got their infrastructure there first and they had the right of way on those rails, they could run their lines. And again, a lot of times the tracks were owned or leased to the power company that was providing electricity for them, so it was in their interest for a lot of reasons to make sure that they kept their right of way on those tracks, because then they're making more money.
And where are these tracks? Are these tracks like at a station outside of town, or where are these tracks that are
It
for
sort of
the
depends
interurban?
on where you are. So if you had a rail system, say a streetcar system in the city, you would probably have to transfer to the interurban system once you got to the city limits, except for if you were in a city that had a terminal that served both. And I'm going to brag on Indianapolis a little bit here. Indianapolis was uh, Indianapolis had the first Union Station train station in the world. It was built in the started construction in the 1840s. And the first Union Station concept came from here because Indianapolis was a major rail hub in this part of the country, served all of the major
Crossroads of
commercial
America.
districts around it. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a reason we got that nickname.
Yeah.
And there were so many different train lines running through the city, but if you got off of one train and you had to catch a train on a different line, you had to get out and walk to the next train station, which was inconvenient. So they built a Union Station, which means all the train lines would come in and dump their passenger traffic in the same building. So it was extremely easy for the people to say, oh, I got off of train line A, I need to be on train line C. I just walk across a couple tracks on the platform and get on the next train. The interurbans, which were also run by competing rail lines, or traction lines in this case, also took a leaf out of the same book. And in 1904, in Indianapolis, they built the world's largest traction terminal, which was still standing until the 70s when they blew it up. I'll get to that. But it cost at the time, let me verify my numbers here because I have my notes here.
While she's
Um,
checking that, I just want to clarify very quickly because I've had this conversation and seen the confusion. The Union Station is not named for a Union railroad line or a Union Railroad Company, which I frequently have seen people think was the case. It is because that's where you brought many lines in to unite. So that was the Union Station. So yes, as Grace is saying, I've always wondered why every U.S. city seems to have a Union Station. Yeah, because you that way you could have all your lines connect, and it became a much more, it's a hub, right? Like you can have
It's a very
multiple
efficient
airlines
system.
arrive at the same airport is way better than having 15 different airports. So
Right.
yes.
And that's exactly the way it was. Imagine if you were trying to fly from place to place and every leg of your flight you had to get out, get a taxi, drive across town to the next airport. It's ridiculous. So
Yes.
the Union Station makes perfect sense if you can lay the tracks to all come together.
And we have
And
another
we
question,
still,
but
oh,
you can finish your thing and then we'll come back to it.
oh, all I was going to say is the seven light rail service providers in and around Indianapolis joined forces and built the Indianapolis Traction Terminal. It was built in 1903, opened in 1904 at a cost of $1 million at the time, which adjusted for inflation is well over $30 million today. So it was not a small building. It was a very, very large, fancy building. Go ahead. Question.
Our question was, were other countries trying to incorporate electric rail at this time, or was it pretty specific to the US at this time?
There were certainly other countries that were utilizing electricity and building building infrastructure for it. I do not know when the rail surge hit, say, Europe. There were definite electric services going in at the same time, but I don't know if it happened the same decade or if they looked at us and said, "Oh, that's actually not a bad idea. Let's do that too." Simply because that's not my personal area, so I haven't researched those dates. Electric rail obviously caught on there. I mean, if we're going to look at mass transit, the U.S. certainly dropped the ball during the mid
We
20th
are
century.
not
Well,
cutting edge at this time, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
we used to have mass transit. We don't now. But Europe does. Europe has a very excellent train system and
And East
pretty
Asia
decent.
has some
Yeah,
amazing systems
Asia
too.
is
Yeah.
running the world in terms of their mass transit systems. They're way ahead of everybody. Um, but here we basically gave up our right of way, and there are reasons for this that I will get into if I have time. But in the mid 20th century, right after World War II, the US did a lot of stupid things. And one of the stupid things we did was giving up the right of way for public transit systems. So now we can't install public transit systems because all the sections of where the track had been are now privately owned. And it would be prohibitively expensive to try to acquire those pieces of land
So
back
you want to
that we
see a
sold
rant go
for a
down,
dollar.
chat? Like when we get started on that one, yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, back to the history parts, and we'll
Yes.
save the rant for a bit. Yeah.
So, in around the beginning of the 20th century, in that 1900 to 1905 is when these union terminals started cropping up. And in Indianapolis, they wisely made the union terminal for the traction station also be the terminals for, or connect to the terminal for the streetcars. So you could come from Chicago, hop on an interurban, come down to Indianapolis via interurban network, get to Indianapolis immediately without leaving the train shed, step onto a streetcar, and go to your final destination. So you aren't stuck trying to find a wagon to take you. You aren't stuck trying to find a cab or something else. It was a very efficient system. And interurbans continued in popularity for the next couple of decades, and they reached their peak in the 1920s. So by the 1920s, you had a vast, vast interurban network, especially in the Midwestern area, because we had a lot of farmland across. And Indianapolis, to take for example, Indianapolis is right in the halfway point between Chicago and Cincinnati, which were two of the biggest commercial shipping hubs in the country at the time. So we had a ton of traffic coming through. So it made sense for us to have a really expansive train network. And our interurban network in the early, around 1915, 1920, was by some reports the most expansive light rail system in the world, just in this state. So there were a lot of tracks. And they did a few things. I mentioned that they provided opportunities for commuters to come in and, now be going into the big city or wherever, or, farmers who wanted to make connections with the downtown markets or something, they could travel easier. They could transport goods more easily. But they also provide a lot of opportunities for the towns they were servicing at home as well. So to use the town I live in, I currently live in a small town, in what used to be a small town that is now part of Indianapolis because Indianapolis grew and just absorbed everything around it. And The interurban came to the town where I live in 1904, and that was the first time electricity had been in this area. And since the interurban, which again had deals with or sometimes were owned by the electric companies, they had electricity that they built the traction lines out, they put in the power poles, they ran the cables, all of this stuff. And then they made it available to residents to buy electricity from the traction line. So for the first time in 1904, the small town where I live, had electricity available. None of those residents had had a power company before who had serviced that area. So it really made a lot of opportunities become available for people to develop their own homesteads, for people to get electric appliances that weren't battery powered. Because you had things like radios and stuff that were battery powered, but if you didn't have battery power or you didn't have the generator working or you couldn't recharge your battery for some reason, you couldn't use your radio. Um,
And
now, the
batteries, yeah, like just like little side note, batteries at that time were extremely limited, um, which is actually why we haven't been driving electric cars for the last century, because we had electric cars before we had gas cars, but the battery tech wasn't able to support them. Do you
yeah,
have any idea how much different the world would be? Like, and all the oil wars and everything would have happened because, yeah, just mind blowing. Okay, carry on.
yep. Yeah,
Batteries.
steam and electric cars both came before internal combustion engines. Internal combustion engines were more uh, plausible for regular use because they didn't require the same level of maintenance. And as Laura said, the battery tech just wasn't there. You couldn't go long distance in an electric car, but they both predated internal combustion engines. So, the next time somebody talks about those newfangled electric cars, you can just smile to yourself. Um, anyway, back to the power companies. The interesting thing, because power was not considered a utility at that time, the power companies were not under any legal obligation to meet the needs of their customers round the clock. So for the power company, their big moneymaker was the interurban. Yeah, the residents could pay for their home hookups too, but the interurban was where most of their power went, and it was not feasible, it was not profitable for them to continue running the power plant 24 hours a day if the trains weren't running in the middle of the night. So when the last train went out of service at the end of the day, they turned off the power. And the next morning, when the first train started service, they turned the power back on. So you could have electricity in your home, but at whatever time the last train stopped running, be it 9 p.m. or 11 p.m. or whatever, the power just turned off every night at that time, and you didn't have power till the next morning.
But
So
it wasn't a utility. It was a
right,
bonus service
it
you
was a
bought from the
service. Yeah, you
transportation company. Yeah.
right. And the antitrust legislation that stopped the interurbans being run by the power companies or giving them substantial price cuts didn't go into effect until the mid 1930s. So around 1935 is when the next stage, we were starting to see more of this anti-monopoly, antitrust legislation go through Congress, from the Gilded Age on, because that was a problem. It really was. But the mid 1930s, they cut back on a lot of what we would consider monopolizing, vertical monopolies and resource monopolies. So in the 1920s, the interurbans reached their peak. People were using them just constantly because you were through World War I at that point. People, the soldiers had come back home. You were having the Roaring Twenties and the baby boom. People were getting out of the house more. People wanted to go more places. People wanted to see the world, and so travel was a big thing. You had more of an established middle class by then, so you had people who had disposable income who, even if they couldn't afford a private car, they could still afford to spend some money on tokens and go someplace for the day. Then the 1930s happened, and the 1930s were really hard on mass transit, partly because of the Great Depression. Immediately, the user base didn't have that disposable income anymore. They didn't have the same freedom to just pack up and go someplace for a weekend because everybody was starting to fret about money and maybe they were out of work, and you had just a lot of social problems coming into play. You also, as I mentioned, that antitrust legislation went through in 1935, right in the middle of the Depression. So the companies that had been scraping by in the Depression years, suddenly their cut rate electricity went away. Now they can't afford to operate. So it only took a few years for the interurbans to go out of operation. And locally in my area, they started reducing their service in the early to mid 1930s, and by 1941 there was not a single interurban in service. There was one interurban company still operating up to 1941. They had two cars. That was it. These are companies that used to run every track, every train leaving on the hour. They had two cars left in their fleet. Um, and so there was an accident that it was not feasible to fix the cars for what they were making off of it. And the state looked at that and said, yeah, no, we're not funding this. The company went out of business, and the only remaining rail service at that time, besides, you had freight rail and you had passenger rail for long distance that were still running on what had been the old steam lines, but you still had the trolleys. The streetcar trolleys, in downtown Indianapolis lasted until the mid 1950s, and then they went away too, because after World War II, everybody immediately went into the American dream of, you have your house and your car and you go on road trips, and it was the heyday of Route 66, and you were starting to see the Eisenhower interstate system went in. So cars were what people wanted, and nobody was using mass transit anymore because it was a luxury to have your own car. Why would you ever take a bus or a trolley or anything else if you had your
Right.
own car? Um,
And it
and
was
there were
amazing
also some,
how much the government, the state and local governments really, really pushed for automobiles instead of public transit. And of course, now we look at this and we're like, what were you thinking?
why?
But I remember reading, and I didn't look it up for this because I didn't know I was going to want to talk about it, but I remember reading about a major city. I want to say it was in Texas, but don't quote me on that.
It
But
was, might have been Dallas. I'm not
was
sure.
it Dallas? That
It
sold,
was a large city in Texas. There are several.
yeah, there are a few that sold their entire city urban transit system to General Motors for the sum of $1. And then General Motors, of course, promptly shut it down because people needed to have cars. And here we are, like in 2021, trying desperately to make public transit a thing. And yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And the right of ways, as I said, they gave up the right of ways, and once the right of ways were gone, there's you can't get them back. If you sold your right of way, or you gave up the right of way and people put buildings on that property or laid streets on that property, you can't come in 50 years later and say, actually, we just decided we're going to put in a drain system, so we're tearing down your building. Thanks. You can't do that. Um, they can seize people's farmland, put an interstate through their century-old fields, but that's a separate issue.
it's another rant for another
Another
time.
rant.
Yeah.
We'll save that rant for later. That's the after hours rant. We we are not a entirely corruption-free nation in terms of our shady business deals going on. In any case, but so the interurban, despite the fact that it's forgotten about, there was about a 30-year period when that is how people traveled. They didn't own cars yet unless they were very wealthy, and they weren't taking passenger rail the way we have like Amtrak and diesel rail now. The interurbans were how people got around. It's how they got from town to town. It's how they commuted. It's how they got to different places. And that era has been kind of just dropped because it wasn't the classic, horse and carriage and coach time that we think of in the Victorian era. And it wasn't yet the roaring 20s where everybody had their convertibles and were playing, jazz and Great Gatsby and all of that. There was
Having
that
entire
that
house
period in the
parties
middle.
in the rumble seat. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, I've seen those rumble seats. Um, but yeah, the interurban was a major part of life, and it really shaped the way that a lot of the small towns in America developed. And at that time, small town life was still a big thing. There were big cities, but there were a lot of people not living in the big cities, because you had a lot of people engaged in careers that were not yet modernized and mechanized the way they are today. You think about, if you look at, and I live in an agricultural state, so I see a lot of farming going on. We have farmers. There are farmers all in my area. Laura owns a farm that farmers are actively harvesting corn and soybeans are on. She lives in that house in the middle of the cornfield that the aliens attack.
Yes. Yes.
um, but you know 100 years ago, you had farmers using horse-drawn equipment or using very limited gas equipment, or doing a lot of manual labor. You didn't have $750,000 combines coming through and doing an entire field in 10 minutes. So it was a lot of you had a lot more people doing that sort of work, and they lived in small rural farming communities all over the country. And those communities largely grew and survived and thrived thanks to the interurbans, because again, that's how they traveled to places, that's how they got their electricity, that's how they got things, people going to town to buy stuff, as opposed to having to take an entire day, hitch up the horses to your wagon, go into town, and it took you several hours to get there. You could just hop on the interurban and be there fairly quickly, because your horses pulling your wagon are probably not going 70 miles an hour, but the interurbans did. um, And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, we have a couple of chat questions and comments, but you can finish your
Okay.
sentence, then I'll come back.
Oh, I was just going to say, I do want to talk about how they changed the landscape of cities as well, but we can do the questions first.
Okay, so I'm going to take these in reverse order. Masoko says, "Always aliens. Can't the rural states be plagued by werewolves or mummies for once?" So yeah,
Mummies are hard because we don't have a lot of mummies in US history that we didn't just like go steal from the Egyptians. Like that's
yeah, yeah. Like most of our native
hard.
mummies were further south. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, the
um,
Southwest could have mummies, but there's not as much agriculture in the Southwest.
yeah, we could have like ghost mammoths in Indiana. That would be. We should have some ghost mammoths.
Ghost giant camels. We
Oh
used to have native giant camels here.
yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll get on that. I said this is an inspiration session. There we go. Um, jump back. Kyle has a question, and this is great because it looks like an A-B question, and it's actually like an essay question. Elena, in today's world, trains more important for transporting freight or passengers?
Oh, okay. So I have opinions. Um, I'm first going to focus in on the word important, and I'm going to say it varies depending on whom about whom you were speaking of the importance to. So trains are still used a lot for freight. Trains are still a critical part of the freight process in America. Um, I would say most people in the US consider trains primarily freight movers. However, if you look at the rest of the world where they actually have functional, efficient passenger rail, I think it could be that we are just not we collectively in the US are not seeing the importance of trains as a potential passenger mover because we have cars. We Americans are obsessed with cars. We really are. Like you cannot function in most parts of America unless you have access to a car. You can't have a job, you can't get to the store. Our cities are not built for walking, our cities are not built for public transit. But if you look at a lot of the problems we're having, we're looking at, hey, there might be oil shortages during some periods of time. Hey, the price of oil has gone up and that's threatening people's livelihoods because they can't afford to get to work. Hey, we have massive amounts of
Traffic.
traffic
Traffic is a
problems.
thing.
Yeah, we have in our city we have road issues as well. We have traffic jams for half the day in parts of the city because the roads aren't well designed to handle the volume of commuter traffic we have. And Indianapolis is a city of mostly bedroom communities. So you have the downtown area where people work during the day, and then they all live 45 minutes away somewhere around the city. If we had commuter trains that could bring those people into downtown and eliminate 90% of that horrible traffic jam, think of how much better transportation would be. Think of how much less pollution there would be from internal combustion vehicles just idling on the interstate for 40 minutes in a traffic jam. So there are a lot of places where trains are used primarily for freight, but I think they should be used more for passenger, and they just aren't because we don't see that as a priority in this country. But then
Well,
if you look
again,
at a
we
place like,
systematically and deliberately disabled our passenger lines. Like that was a
right,
choice that we made. Wasn't a
and
great
now
choice, but
people
it is
don't
one.
see that as an option because
Right.
a lot of people in the
Well, I'm not
US,
trying to think of it as like I
right,
suggested to somebody who was trying to get to a conference, and she's like, "Well, I can't drive that far," and it wasn't that far. It was like, okay, it wasn't that far. I'd say as an American, it would have been like an 8-hour drive. It's not a
you
big
and I
deal.
are the outliers in our driving
Well,
habits.
also like Americans and the English we consider long distances totally. Anyway, the point
Yeah.
is, and I said, well, jump on the train, and she's like, people can't take trains, and I'm like, oh, actually, but it's just like the average American that's not even like a menu item on transportation.
Right.
Mention real quick, Masoko says, it's been interesting seeing California's struggle trying to develop a high speed rail. As Elena just mentioned, the cities aren't always conducive to foot traffic or local commuter options. Yeah, you really can tell we're actually a fairly young country, and a lot of our cities were built, recently built for automobiles. We're not ever built for walking or for horses. Yeah.
Well, and like again to use Indianapolis as an example, Indianapolis was a plotted city. It was planned. They chose a site, they hired a city designer, and the immediate downtown area, which is what the city was built, when it was first built in the early 1800s, that's what they built. Um, actually is very logically laid out. The streets are a grid, there's a circle at the middle, and there's four diagonal streets going out to the corners. And it's very easy to get around in. But the problem is the city grew, and the periods of time in which the city was expanding were dominated by different types of technology.
Yeah.
So the city, even though the core of it is extremely functional and very compact and very easy to walk around in, it's what makes it a great convention city. Once you get outside of that immediate downtown area, you can't move. There are no sidewalks. The
Yeah.
streets are laid out weird. It's impossible to get from point A to point B. And a lot of the cities in the US had that same problem where maybe when they were first founded, they were logically designed and you can walk around certain older parts of town. But then they came in and ran an interstate through the middle of the city. And now you can't get from one side of the interstate to the other because they didn't put sidewalks or crosses in or anything. It's just, yeah,
And it's
it's
the difference. Like if you go to an older city, like any medieval city, and of course everything now that once you get out into the suburbs, it's all sprawl because again, newer technology. That's what we plan for. But if you go back to older cities, I mean, my husband and I were in Rome during a transportation strike. Okay, so the only way we could travel was on foot. We got everywhere we wanted to be during the transportation strike because, well, Rome was never designed for the automobile, right? Like you just walk from the forum to the next place because that's what you were doing. So
and
yeah,
that's the reason a lot of those cities have embraced public transit because you can't put a car down some of those medieval streets. There's just no room for it.
no.
So public transit makes more
And you
sense in those
certainly can't put
situations.
30,000 cars on that block. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is true. And there are cities in the U.S. that have public transit. There are a number of cities that have subways. New York, it's pretty easy. You can't drive in New York. I've done it, but you don't want to. It's difficult to get around by car in many parts of New York because it's just too congested. But they do have an expansive subway system, so you can just hop on and go from point A to point B. But once you get out of New York City, if you go to upstate New York, there is no public transit except for the Amtrak line that runs through the north part of the state, and that only runs on alternate days. So, it's really dependent on where you are. But back to the
Grace,
question, I think rail traffic or rail service in general is important for both freight moving and for passenger systems or passenger movement systems. But part of the problem is in the US, because the freight lines own the rails, our train services are never going to be able to compete with things like European or Asian train systems where the passenger lines are the main function. Because even though technically they're not allowed to, since the freight lines own the tracks and the passenger lines run on at the mercy of the freight trains. If there's a freight delay, the passenger trains get delayed. Then people don't want to take the train next time because they were late getting to their destination, and it's messy.
yeah.
But
Yeah, and Grace points out, Grace is from New Zealand, so she points out on my
they
travels,
have
I've
nice
heard
trains in
train
New Zealand.
whistles. I'm sorry.
There are nice trains in New Zealand. I rode them.
There are nice trains in New Zealand. She said train whistles all over the U.S. in places where she couldn't take a train, which is sad because she likes train travel. I love
Yeah.
train travel. I really do. Like it's one of the best ways to travel.
There
So and
are
Shy,
certain routes that you do have good train service on. Like if you need to go from Chicago to Seattle, the Empire Builder is a great way to travel. Takes two and a
yes,
half days, which is not as fast as flying, but it's really comfortable and you've got nice scenery and it goes right through the national parks and it's really nice.
yeah. And Shy Fox says South Dakota used to have Amtrak, but we haven't for a long time.
Yeah. So Amtrak has been somewhat mishandled, is a good way to put that in
See
terms of
above,
making
we
it a,
deliberately scuttled our yes,
yeah. Amtrak got there were some decisions made that probably were not in the best long-term interest of establishing a good, reliable passenger service. Now, if you go to the East Coast, there are actually a decent number of local trains that you could go from Boston to New York or something, and those trains tend to be fairly affordable, fairly reliable. They travel, quickly and on time. But the long distance Amtrak travel is even though I love doing it and I do it quite a lot actually because it's I can work on the way to my destination, but then people can't bother me because I can turn off my phone. Oh no, I'm on a train, I can't hear you. Um, but the the potential for delays again because of the freight lines or because of other things is high. So it's not something where, if you need to be at your destination by a certain hour, fly. You aren't going to take a train because the train can always be late.
and let's just
Um,
clarify for a sec, like what we mean is the way things sorted out. This is the hugely condensed version. Is the passenger trains are running on railroad lines, which are owned by the freight companies. Well, when that was for reasons, okay, yeah, but when that was set up, the government's idea was that if the freight trains delayed the passenger trains, then the passenger, the Amtrak could ask for compensation, and so that would keep everything balanced and shared. Except then the government's like, oh, actually, you can't ask for compensation. So the freight trains said, oh, you mean we can just use this line and put in a 10-hour delay and there are no consequences? Okay. And so that's, yeah, and that has been, they've started to correct that recently, but that is where we went through this incredible period where Amtrak was not reliable, and that's the reason why. So,
which hurt Amtrak's reputation. It hurt Amtrak's
yeah,
profits. So then Amtrak had to be subsidized by the government. So then people were complaining, why are we paying government funds based out of, coming out of taxpayer dollars to subsidize a failing
because
train line? Well,
taxpayer
the
dollars
reason it's
are also
failing
paying
is
for
because,
automobiles and airplanes, but fine, we don't want to
yeah,
discuss that. Yeah. Anyway,
yeah, we've got issues with that.
but I'm going to grab Shai's comment about train travel is amazing. Loved the Shinkansen from Kyoto to Tokyo. Yeah, the Shinkansen is the bullet train, and all of the Japanese trains are amazing. And then Shinkansen are like the next level up, and they are fast and they are luxurious, and yeah, they're great.
And that's a case where in Japan, trains are primarily used for passenger rail. There is much less freight hauling on train lines in Japan because that's the way everybody gets around. There are fewer cars. And it's actually not uncommon for people in Japan to not even have a driver's license because they don't need one. They don't own a car. They live
Yeah,
in cities where they can go anywhere on a train.
yeah,
And that's true in parts of Europe as well, depending on where you live. But in the US, you have to have a car in almost all of the US. And obviously, if you live in downtown New York and you work in downtown New York and you never leave the city, you might not need to own a car. You might not need to have a driver's license. But most places in the US are set up like suburbs. It's actually the majority of the US population lives in suburbs. So you might have to drive 10 or 15 minutes to get to a grocery store. Until a couple of years ago when they opened a grocery a few miles from me, I had to drive 10 minutes to get to a grocery store. And I don't live that far out. Like I live in the city. So that's just the way our cities are. That's the way life is in America now. You can't just walk places. So,
yeah.
real quick, because we were talking about world building, I do want to talk about the city layouts. So
Oh yeah.
the interurban period the heyday only lasted about 30 years, but it was 30 years when there was also a lot of urban expansion going on. You started seeing cities getting larger. You had people starting to move from the outlying areas to the city to work. And so during that time, you had a lot of things built around the concept of interurban travel. And if you are in many cities, you can still find relics of the interurban. In some places, that's road layout, where like there's a major road on the south side of Indy that the right of way for the interurban became a median between the two lanes of the street because the interurbans ran right down the middle of the street, just like a streetcar. They just were bigger and faster and had their own lane. So you can still see the original one lane road on one side, then you have this grassy median, some trees, and then you have like the 4 lane road where the road became a major thoroughfare later on, and they just expanded it on one side of the median. But that median is where the interurban ran, and some of the original traction line poles with the insulators are still running along that street. So you'll still see streets laid out like they were for the interurbans. There are also street names like in Indy, just for example, we have streets that are called Stop 11, Stop 12, Stop 13. They never renamed them. The roads were named because that's where the interurban stopped between two towns. And then when the city expanded to that point, they just named the roads they built after the interurban stops. A lot of times if you're looking at sort of the community flavor for your stories and you have something where technology has come through, in my area where I live, there's a building that was built in the 1890s, and it was a sort of a hardware store, general store. It's been a lot of different things, but it was always owned by the same family and operated by the same family. And the interurban stopped near the store but there was no actual interurban depot there. It was just a stop and you got off on the side of the road. But because the nearest building was this general store, all the people who wanted to ride the interurban would gather in the lobby of that store and wait for the interurban because there were windows they could watch. And when they saw the train coming down, they could go out and get on it. And that way they didn't have to stand out in the cold weather. And eventually, the shopkeeper actually expanded the front of the store and put in what was basically a little breezeway with doors and glass, so people had more insulation from the weather when they were waiting for the interurban. So that shaped the way buildings were built. So a lot of times, the technology and the phases of technology we see dictate how buildings are constructed, dictate how streets are laid out, dictate, how the direction in which a town expands. And if you look at buildings that were built, prior to the 1930s or 40s, a lot of them have higher ceilings and they have transoms, those little windows that open over the door. Victorian houses frequently had a tower, so you would have a tower with high windows, and then the interior rooms had 9-foot ceilings instead of modern ceilings are 8 feet. And then they would have transoms over the door. That was an early cooling system for your house because you would open the windows at the top of the tower and open all the transoms over the doors, and the hot air would rise to the top of the ceiling and get pulled up by the air escaping out the windows because all the hot air rises to the tower. And that's how you kept your house cool. Once we had forced air, once we had air conditioning, and things like that and climate control, then all the ceilings dropped to 8 feet. But the technology dictated the way the buildings were constructed, because humans are actually pretty smart and they figured out how to do things even before they had technology to do things. So I do want to throw that out in terms of world building. What technology your world has will dictate what your world looks like. And even if it's not the current technology, if it was the technology 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago, those impressions are still going to be around because that's how society works. Unless you had,
That's why
your
our
entire
roads are 2 horse butt wide. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The reason, and actually that affects train rails too. The reason rail cars have the wheels set at the exact width they do is because the standard was set based on the wagon ruts that were on the old Roman roads, which were caused by the width of 2 horse butts. So we're still using standards that were set in place based on horse technology.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
so those are important things to look at. How does the technology in the worlds you're creating, whether that's for a story or a game campaign or anything, how has technology shaped what your world actually physically looks like? Because that's
And
going to affect it.
if you need exposition, people standing around gabbing at the overhang, waiting for the an urban to come by is way better than, as you know, Steve, like, just dumping things like, you have a
As you know,
reason.
Steve, 98 years ago, when our town was called this and had this mayor and had this.
Yeah, but I mean, you have a reason for people to be hanging out, waiting for the public transportation, which is not something that maybe you were thinking you had that option to have people hanging out there. So we do have one more question from Kyle, asking if there are any commercial maglev high-speed rail lines in the USA today.
I wish. Um, Supposedly, someone is looking into it. That is as far as we've gotten with maglev. There have been some, I think, some successful experiments with it out west for very short distances. Uh, Realistically, and the US is a big country. I mean, it's not Russia big because Russia has 16 time zones and we only have 4, but we do have 4 time zones. Like we are a fairly large country. So there are lots of parts of the country where it is just geographically not feasible to try to power maglev for the distance and over the terrain that we would have to do. I think maglev is very feasible for small, more local, like you have the East Coast commuter stuff. I think that's more likely to happen. I don't know that we're going to get the kind of long distance rail like, we've got Amtrak lines running from one coast to the other. You can go from New York to LA or something. You have to take a couple of jogs in there, Chicago to Seattle, that sort of thing. But I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of commercial venues for long distance maglev travel just because it's going to cost so much to put in and to run, to operate. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And we're right now, America. It's a great country. Great country. I like living here. But like we are still having people fighting the transition to alternate forms of electric power. There are still people out protesting, how dare you take away our coal burning power plants? And we're like, actually, statistically, your coal plants are poisoning your populace. And here's all the cases of people living around the coal plants with lung disease directly tied to the coal plants. And people are still resistant to the idea of replacing coal with solar,
Change is
wind,
really
anything
scary. Yeah.
else. Like
Yeah.
there is a huge contingent of the populace in the US that does not want clean energy. That's just it's the way it's always been done. We're going to have our dirty energy and like it. And so even the concept of maglev for anybody to want to put funding that is not just private experimental funding into that, you're going to see a lot of people fighting it. And it's kind of America's a very diverse country. We have a lot of different opinions. We have a lot of people who are very vocal about their different opinions, but it means it's hard to get stuff done
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
have to try to make
But
everybody happy.
we're gonna keep talking. We're gonna keep educating. Ask me
Yeah,
about my solar powered electric car, please.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
We do need to um, wrap up because Elaine. Well, actually, I should ask: are you streaming tonight too?
I am
Or
streaming tonight, but
okay,
I did post on my social media that it would be, whenever this wraps up, because my channel hosts your channel when I'm offline. So in theory, if
okay.
somebody logs onto my channel in
They
three
can see
minutes and
that you're
says
here.
they can see that I'm here, yeah.
All
So
right. Well,
so
what
it
we
is not
could
a
do.
we have to be off by 7:59.
Okay. Well, we could start to wrap up. So I would say, the real salties, I see your question. Let's wrap our topic for tonight, and then I can come back and hit that after we let Elena go, since that's a off-topic writing question. So if there are any remaining questions about transportation, world building, uh, rail, equine influenza, robber barons, or electric cars, we can
I can
squeeze
speak at
those
length on
in.
robber barons as well.
I'm
I have a whole
sorry.
presentation on how the Gilded
Oh
Age
yeah,
shaped literature.
she can get quite eloquent on robber barons, and I'm actually probably going to bring that back in at some point. So yes, Fifi Worldsmaker, we will definitely raid Elena's channel once we give
Ah,
her a chance to get up and running. So yes, thank you. That you would really appreciate you guys sticking around for that raid. Yes, Kyle, I introduced us at the beginning. We are siblings, so we are sisters. We are not twins. We get that
there are
question a
not
lot,
that
but
many people with this name. We
there are
can
not
spell
that
it,
many
therefore you know
VanArendonks.
it's ours.
Yeah. So oh, hey, Joe, thanks for stopping by. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm not seeing uh, other questions coming in. So let's let you go, Elena, and then I
Okay.
will answer the writing questions, and then we will raid you. Whee!
Okay. I'm
Okay.
gonna go turn some lights on because it's actually starting to get dark in here.
Okay.
So,
Oh, and
all
if
right.
you have not been in the habit of following Elena, she is not going to speak on trains when on her stream. She's actually doing a sponsored cosplay build from Tales of Vesperia. And oh my gosh, I just totally blanked on his name. Who are you
Flynn.
building?
Flynn Chifo.
Flynn. I could have gotten this out of multiple choice, but I just blanked. So she's building out a bunch of armor and other thermoplastic fun things, and so it's a
Today I'm
sponsored
mostly
build, and she's
sewing
building
magnets
everything
on
live. So
stuff, but
what was that? I'm sorry.
I
Just
said today
talking.
I'm mostly sewing magnets on stuff, but
Oh, okay.
if you
So you
have,
want
I am
exciting
totally
magnet
open to
sewing.
Q&A. Yeah, so like if you just want to throw questions at me while I'm sewing magnets on stuff, that's cool too.
Yeah, and they can be questions about magnets because she knows so many
How do they
things
work?
about
I'm not
magnets.
answering that one.
All right. So let's let you go, and then I will answer this other question, and then we will raid you. So,
Okay. I'll be
oh,
on in a minute.
oh yes, I'm going to go ahead and throw into the chat. She is, and sewing is half the battle. Let me see if I can type and talk at the same time. All right. Hopefully that is going into the. I
Yes, I
think I
see it.
spelled that right. Okay, good.
Yep.
Yeah. And yes, yes, she will tell you that glue gunning on your own body is a bad idea because she
I
will
will tell
speak
you
from
from personal
personal
experience.
experience on that. Yeah. Yeah, Elena and I started cosplaying in 2003. Is that
Two.
right?
Two.
2002? Yeah, some
Mm-hmm.
freaking long time ago.
19
And
years.
yeah, if there is a way to do it wrong, we can tell you. And then we also she has a whole stream on how to do it right as well. So please follow her for that. So okay. So okay. thank you, Elena, for giving us a great interurban background, and hopefully people will find that useful in their own world creation. And yeah, I'm going to let you go. So everybody wave goodbye to Elena. Bye. Whoosh. Okay. All right. And then I'm going to let Elena take off and get set up. We'll raid her in just a moment. And then I'm going to jump back to, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? In the chat. Oh, the Real Salties is asking about Wattpad. So the answer is it depends. And that's not a terribly helpful answer, but it is the most accurate answer. Especially if you are, getting started, you haven't built a huge audience yet, and you're looking for feedback, Wattpad's probably a good venue for that. If you are trying to become a commercial writer, writing professionally and getting paid for your work, it's extremely hard to get traction with that on Wattpad. And if you're building an audience on Wattpad and then you're like, but now I have a book for sale over here, most of those people are not going to follow you from a non-paying platform to a paying platform. So that's a long way of saying it depends. But especially if you are, and I have no idea, I'm sorry, where you are, what you're doing at this point. But I would say if you are not making solid money as a writer at this time, and just looking for, I want to experiment with this, I want to play with this, I want to get feedback on my work, let people leave comments and things, then yeah, look into that. It could be a good option. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, and so next week we'll cycle back around again on our weekly themes. Next week is a business topic, and we're going to be talking about Evernote. Yay! That is a topic by request. And Evernote is software. It comes in multiple tiers. There's free tiers. There's paid tiers, and it is basically let me dump all of my brain into this digital memory account so that I don't have to take up my mental RAM in remembering things. It's similar to OneNote and some other things. Evernote's my favorite, and I'm going to tell you all the ways I use it and all the tips and tricks for it. That's not true. There's way too many tips and tricks, and I'm not going to be able to tell you all of them. But I'm going to give you an overview and explain what I use it for in writing and then in just managing my entire life. Yes, business stuff, math stuff. Yes, all the things. Evernote does have a free tier. That is definitely what I would recommend to get started. It has some advanced features that are only available on the paid tiers, but honestly, you're probably not going to need that at this point if you're not already using Evernote. The major drawback to the free tier for most people is that you can only sync, I believe, between 2 devices, whereas I sync between 3 devices regularly, meaning anything I add on my phone instantly appears on my computer desktop and vice versa and such. So if you are a person who has a tablet and a phone and a laptop and a desktop computer and all the things going on, then you're not going to be able to have everything synced across the board at the free level. But we'll talk more about that next week and have all the things. Grace says, I need it. Oh my gosh, Evernote, I can't tell you how much I rely on it. I've used it for so long, and it has definitely been a lifesaver in so many situations. So anyway, so next week we will talk about Evernote. What else is going on? Did I make myself any notes to share? I don't remember. I'll give you the quick heads up. I have an unofficial monarch butterfly farm going on. If you want to see way too many pictures of caterpillars eating milkweed and chrysalises and monarchs hatching, and do they hatch? I don't know, emerging from a chrysalis, then check out my Instagram, which is VanArendonk Baugh. It's pretty straightforward. You just have to copy paste it so you don't have to try to spell that. And I've been updating that pretty regularly with caterpillar pictures. So there you go. And yeah, that is it. Let's hop over and raid Elena. Yes. Yeah, Shy Red Fox, I saw that you said you had been, formally, mine was completely accidental this year. I planted some milkweed. I'm not even really a gardener. I just needed something positive and productive to do in pandemic spring. And so I'm like, oh, pollinator garden. Oh my gosh, so many caterpillars. And so I've been out like desperately scavenging for additional milkweed and all of that. I'm going to do some milkweed harvest this weekend. So, okay. So we're going to hop over and raid Elena. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me. I will see you next week. Take care. Be excellent to each other.